If you like to read, if you like to think, if you like to see the world differently, grab yourself a book, give this show a listen. Purple Lit Nerd gonna show you what you're missing.
Hooray, hooray, hooray. Welcome to the Purple Lit Nerd podcast for April the 21st, 2018. I am your host, the amazingly adorable Rebecca Thistle, podcasting to you live-ish from my kitchen/dining room table in my apartment, which I call Jeffrey Thistlework. Yay! So, continuing on my series of shows about Shakespeare. Oh, I love Shakespeare. I want to really get into Shakespeare sonnets because, first we sort of talked about the history of the sonnet and then we talked about the structure of the sonnet. Well, now we're going to talk about Big Willie, my homeboy. That always makes me laugh. Like, oh my gosh, you're so white and nerdy and stupid. Well, not stupid, just ridiculous. Amazingly awkward. Or no, it's amazingly adorable. Awesomely awkward is what I am. So before I can really get into the sonnets themselves, I think a sort of mini biography of Shakespeare is in order here. So Shakespeare was born in 1564. April 23rd is generally acknowledged as being his birthday. He was actually baptized on April 26th in 1564, but usually they didn't do that until a couple of days, 2-3 days after the child had been born. So we generally accept that he was born on April 23rd. He was born to John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. And I was just watching a documentary about the life of Shakespeare, and not much was said about Mary, which kind of upsets me because I want to know stuff. But then again, I didn't really go out and look for more, so shame on me. But what's interesting about his father that I think is significant to understanding a little bit about Shakespeare is his father was a glover and a tanner, but he at some point was actually mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon, and I just got a Facebook notification. I really should silence my phone while I'm recording, shouldn't I? Oh well. You'd think I'd take a moment to just silence it because that's what you should do, but I don't want to. So, anyways. So, John Shakespeare was actually John Shakespeare was actually mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon, which is where Shakespeare was born and raised. And even though he didn't live there for the entirety of his adult life, that was always home for him. That's also where he was buried. I'm pretty sure that's where he died as well. So John Shakespeare was mayor for a while, and because of how things were done, whenever Johnny Boy had to go to council meetings and stuff like that, there was this huge procession from the front of the Shakespeare house to the council building, city hall, whatever. So I find that very significant. Also, if you don't know much about that time in English history, it was the time of the Protestant Reformation, and so it was essentially illegal to be Catholic in England, and John was probably a secret Catholic. And anyways, because religion and politics got amalgamated so often, conflagrated is probably the word I'm looking for. There was no separation of church and state, is what I'm trying to say. you had a lot of spies that were going on. A lot of spies. So John Shakespeare was actually at some point fined by the Queen, and it's not clear if he was fined because he was secretly Catholic and not going to church and not taking the Protestant communion like the law dictated, or if it was because he'd gotten involved in some illegal wool trade, which sounds really weird and strange, but, laws are laws, yo. So, there's a little bit of rebelliousness in that family. So, Shakespeare was educated, very, very well educated. This documentary I was watching on Netflix is called Shakespeare, The Legacy. Go check it out. He was educated in typical Renaissance fashion in the classics of Greek and Latin, and the education he received in Greek and Latin would probably be comparable to something you would get at a college level in modern society. But back then, you're 6 years old or 7 years old or whatever, and you got up at 6 in the morning and you went to school and you studied for hours upon hours on end, and then awesomeness. But part of those studies that is, I think, highly significant was he had to learn rhetoric and dialectic, I guess is the word I'm looking for, skills, meaning he had to be very well educated and adept at seeing both sides of any argument. And this is going to be significant for getting into the sonnets, and you'll find out why. So just keep that in mind. He was very well educated and very good at not only seeing both sides of an argument, but presenting both sides of an argument. So that was his childhood. When he was 18 years old, he quite possibly just had a lover's tryst with a woman who was about 8 years older than him. Funnily enough, this made me laugh my ass off. I'd known this before, and then I'd forgotten it, and then I read it again, and I went, that's funny. Shakespeare's wife was named Anne Hathaway. Yeah, I know. But probably what happened was there was a huge harvest festival, and, the Elizabethan equivalent of, Marvin Gaye was playing in the background, and bada bing, bada boom, Anne Hathaway got knocked up. She was 26 years old, and that's pretty old to not be married. But here's the thing about that is, at that time, the law dictated that you had to get married, or you couldn't get married unless you were 21 or older. So she had to have been knocked up in order for Shakespeare to marry her at the tender age of 18, which, if you're following along, is not the age of 21. But they had 3 kids together. Suzanne was their oldest, and then twins Hamnet and Judith. And best I can tell, shortly after the twins were born, Shakespeare essentially decided that he wanted to go to London. It's sort of hazy, this period of time between the birth of the twins, essentially, and then when we really start seeing, historically speaking, him showing up in London and productions and stuff. The most plausible explanation that I believe is that a traveling troupe of actors came through Stratford-upon-Avon, and Shakespeare went and had his aha moment and ran away. Essentially ran away with the circus, but it wasn't a circus. It was, traveling actors. And he was an actor and a playwright, and he owned the Globe, and hopefully what he actually did in his lifetime, or in his career, I should say. He was patronized, which sounds weird to say, but I do believe that is the proper word. He was patronized not only by the Queen, and then once Elizabeth passed away, he was patronized by James, the King. But he was a lot of different nobles supported him. This is old school Patreon, if you're familiar with that. And and he did all that, and then he died on April 23rd, 1616, at the age of, what would that be, 52? And like I said, he was buried in Stratford upon Avon. Come on, Becca. So that's the life of Shakespeare in a nutshell. Now, what about the sonnets? Where did they come into play? Well, what we know is that they were collected and published in 1609 by a man named Thomas Thorpe, who was apparently very obsequious and a little bit shady sometimes, but, then again, who isn't? But they're published in 1609, and there's sort of this question of whether or not Shakespeare knew, let alone consented to the publication of the sonnets. Now, based on everything I've read and heard regarding this, I'm apt to believe that he was okay with it. Because apparently Shakespeare was not afraid to stand up for himself. Like, if he felt he'd been wronged, he'd take it to the court. Excuse me. We got some crazy weather going on here, so it's a wonder that I can talk at all. I'm surprised, my allergies haven't, completely imploded my head. So, yeah. So, I'm guessing that he was, at least, alright, go ahead, whatever. If he wasn't, all on board with it. So, what I want to talk about specifically today is his fair youth sonnets. Now, what does that mean, Becca? Okay, so Shakespeare had this collection of sonnets that got published in 1609, had 154 sonnets. He probably wrote a lot more. They just probably got lost over time. But the first 126 sonnets are addressed to a fair youth. And it is generally agreed upon that this fair youth was a young man who was very, very pretty. And, usually your love poems, people read love sonnets from Shakespeare. That comes usually from the fair youth cycle. For example, Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more fair and more temperate. No. Ugh, I hate that one. I really do. But, in any event, the fair youth sonnets make up the bulk of the Shakespearean sonnet canon. And these are collectively are generally the most talked about and controversial of all of Shakespeare's sonnet, because once you get into the last bit of his sonnet,